So we actually started with the advantage of solving our own pain point. We started with the advantage of knowing there was a group of people who this would be very useful for because it was us.
Leo is very, very humble here. His open source project is actually widely adopted by teams like Amazon.
We got well known by all the people reading blog posts as well. They were read by obviously a huge amount of the data science community, but also other bloggers. And so we got to the point where like everyone was publishing blog posts using data pain.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Beyond Algorithms. I'm so excited today. We have a guest here, Leo. Actually, I met Leo 12 years ago when we were both in YC, but he did so many cool things afterwards.
Hi, everyone. I'm June. Welcome to the show and welcome, Leo. Leo, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Hi, everybody. Great to be on the show. My name's Leo. I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called PumpUp. And what we're building is a mobile-first AI assistant for small businesses. A little bit of history. So as Frost mentioned, we were on YC together in 2013, so 12 years ago. She just reminded me, though I thought it was a lot less. And since that, I've built a couple of companies on both sides of the Atlantic, one of which was DataPain. And DataPain was the most popular way for data science teams to create reports in Python. And so we started off as an open source library, became a very popular open source library, and then have a whole bunch of lessons throughout that process on scaling an open source business, the pitfalls of some of the risks of building a business like that, and some of the strategies also for monetization that I'm excited to dig into.
Yeah, Leo is very, very humble here. His open source project is actually widely adopted by teams like in NVIDIA, Amazon. It's one of the most trending repo. So I'm really curious, Leo, like how did you initially grow all this very loyal user base of all these top data scientists to know about you and to start using your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it starts with actually solving a problem that we had ourselves. So we built DataPain by accident, actually. So we were running another company, and the problem we were facing is that we were building lots of models for our clients. So companies like TripAdvisor, HEB, like a lot of big enterprises. And we'd find that we had this extremely automated process for creating the models and actually running the data science. But then when it came to delivering the results to people who were not technical, we would be throwing all of that out, taking a bunch of plots and data sets and copying and paste them into PowerPoint documents, which we'd then send over, and there'd be this huge back and forth. But they'd say, oh, interesting. Well, what happens if we rerun the model on this window or whatever? And so I became this kind of like professional PowerPoint editor, as opposed to, spending my time in the code or in the data. And so we actually built DataPain in that company, and we built it as an internal library for us to create interactive documents so we could run our pipelines and create this document that could be sent to the end user. And so that was the inception story of it. So we actually started with the advantage of solving our own pain point. We started with the advantage of knowing there was a group of people who this would be very useful for because it was us. And the initial users were just us and our friends, basically. So we sent it to a bunch of other people who we knew who had the pain point. The first time that it became really widely used, I think we got a couple of users where we were experimenting with posting it on Reddit, posting it on Hacker News, getting some people on top of funnel there. Where it really took off is actually through, we thought, okay, where do data scientists hang out? What are the things that if you are a data scientist, you are looking in your inbox, what are the channels? And we actually found that there are all these specific blogs for data science. So things like KD Nuggets, where we'd post job ads just because it gave us great brand visibility to do that. And also channels towards data science and Medium. And so what we did is we realized that there was this similar pain point for people who were publishing data science content on the web. So a lot of people were writing blog posts, and a lot of students were actually trying to build up their CV or build up their reputation by writing data science content. And they really struggled because they do all these amazing things and build all these amazing interactive plots, and then they couldn't share them. You can only take a screenshot and then put it inside of a Medium post, whatever. So we actually worked with a few of them to start, where we said, okay, we'll give you the ability to create interactive reports that can go inside of your Medium posts. And so when they started doing that, then we got well known by all the people reading blog posts as well. They were read by obviously a huge amount of the data science community, but also other bloggers. And so we got to the point where everyone was publishing blog posts using DataPain. We had embeds inside of those blog posts, and that provided like 99% of our top of funnel.
That's a great story.
This-
I'm curious, you sort of skipped a step already, talking about the adoption already, but in the very beginning, why did you choose to open source it? Is it just a default thinking, or is it an afterthought? Or like, why is this something that you feel you should just open source and let people use it?
It's a very good question. I think it was just a default thinking, actually. I don't think we put a huge amount of thought into it. To be frank, I'm not sure if we were doing this company again, whether we would open source it in the same way now. I think we thought we were existing at a layer of the stack where you didn't have a choice. So if you think about like the environment that DataPane existed in, it wasn't a standalone platform. You'd be importing it into a Jupyter notebook. It was a package on pip. It was something that, we very much worked with the open source ecosystem. So we worked with like Plotly and Bokeh and Matplotlib, and a lot of them also publish DataPane on their documentation. So they say, okay, if you want to publish this plot, you should use DataPane. Here's how to do it. And so I think that because everything around us was open source, we just took it for granted that we would be open source as well.
And maybe that naturally lead to the next question. Like, at which point did you realize this is like you stumbled upon this thing that could potentially be a standalone company by itself?
It's a good question. I think it's when I woke up one day and someone had published this blog post, DataPane, and we were not ready for it at all. We were just like, we'd like pushed a new version. We woke up and it was, as these things always are, it was like Friday night, something in the UK. And we just saw the traffic go like, and then I had like a book my calendar link on the website. And then I just looked at my calendar and it was like meetings for 3 weeks. I then had like an MSA contract out for an enterprise deal within like 3 days with like a public company. So it just really suddenly happened. And I think that's kind of like, it became just kind of like obvious. We didn't really intellectualize it at that point. It was just like, oh my God, there's a lot of top of funnel here.
That's the power of open source, and not a very different story from some of the other open source catching up story. But then your old consulting, or not consulting, but like a data science company, then it got sort of wrapped under it then?
Yeah, it got wrapped under. We were also having problems with that company whereby we'd always wanted to build a software business. We got sucked into like this consulting stuff, which was completely our own fault because the money was good. But we kind of realized at some point, we were like, if we were going to be intellectually honest with ourselves, what are these companies really buying? And once I went to them, because we had this whole like interactive app, we were charging like per month. So we were kind of tricking ourselves that it was a subscription revenue business. And I went to one of them. I went to actually TripAdvisor. And I was like, would this be any different if we just emailed you a CSV? And they were like, no, that'll be fine. We don't really care about the products. We just want you to do our data science work because it's cheaper than getting the internal teams to do it. So at that point, we realized like the old thing we were doing was not a great business. Even though we probably could have built like something that made a lot of money, it wasn't the kind of company we wanted to build. I didn't want to build a consultancy. So it kind of naturally one thing led into another.
That feels much less painful than I had expected. But now let's look at DataPane now you look at this open source project as a business and semi-accidentally land yourself into this position. What is the overall thinking about now? How do you grow this business? How do you let more people know about this? How do you, probably more importantly than traditional open source project, like how do you generate revenue on top of it?
Yeah, so I think at this point, the mistake we made is we put the cart before the horse when it came to what is marketing and what is true product market fit. So I mentioned we had this like accidental growth channel around embedding, and we became very addicted to that because it makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you have product market fit. You have hundreds of thousands of people using it and all of these other things. The problem with doing that before you understand your ICP or understand who are the personas you're selling to, or understand, okay, can we map out that entire sales process for what we need to do to build a real company here, is you spend all of your energy as a company focusing on marketing, and that marketing doesn't always lead somewhere. So we started doing a lot of initiatives like really making the product great for sharing plots online, right? Because we got a ton of top of funnel for it. We built a lot of like social stuff for bloggers who wanted people to be able to comment on their plots and all this stuff. It was actually features that were pretty much useless for the enterprise users. And what we missed throughout all of this is doing the like very unsexy hard work of like, okay, if we're going to build a business around this, what are the fundamentals we need to do in terms of pricing? What are the fundamentals we need to do in terms of like deal structure? And what I mean by that is selling reporting, because they basically fit under that budget, reporting, any kind of software like that. It's a pretty complex sales process. You have the original person who's bringing it in, who's technical, who's a data scientist. They probably don't have much budget outside of, 50 couple $100 a month, whatever it is. The real budget comes from the business units that are consuming the data science. Those business units, in our case, it was usually marketing. Sometimes it was like a specific business unit in a larger organization. And so the hard bit of building that company is how do you cross the chasm from the person who's really excited to be able to publish their Jupyter notebook internally and allow people to use it, to the person who has budget, who is consuming the output of that process, but doesn't care about Python. They may not even know what Python is. They don't want something technical. They just like want an answer. And so that's a very complex sales process to execute. And it's quite an expensive sales process to execute because you have to have multiple meetings with lots of stakeholders. So we only realized these structural difficulties with the business probably too late because we were so focused on marketing, so focused on like, you know, being like the hot thing versus like solving these kind of like unsexy problems with the sales process.
When you say marketing, is it safe to say is like consumer or end user marketing? It's different from, I don't know, the person who pay kind of marketing.
Yeah, totally. I think that's absolutely fair. And I think when we started to see open source as a marketing channel, there are three kind of different ways we looked at it. The first way is brand. So, okay, I go to datapane.com and I see this as a star on GitHub button. I immediately think, oh, this is for people like me. This is an open source library. I trust it. I go to GitHub and I see that this is something that is built for people like me. So there's just like the brand side. I think some companies have been really good at using open source, not as top of funnel, but just as a way to build a product, which is something developers love. The second side is the pre-sale side. So open source can be a really good way for someone just to get up and running with your product inside their company without going through a formal sales process. We have that a lot as well. So it would just be like our proof of concept will be like pip install this or run this Docker image and we will get started. And then there's the third one, which is open source as top of funnel. So I'm basically going to find users through open source. We had this weird like social component as well, which I think is probably quite unique to DataPane, but that's basically top of funnel, right? It's like acquisition, demand generation as well from open source. And those are three very different things. And I think you don't have to do all of them. You can just choose one of them and say, I'm going to use open source for this. So yeah, I think we should have been a little bit more thoughtful around that as well.
And now we're at this phase of like trying to decide which kind of marketing do we do. How long did that take for you to realize you're a little bit late in that transformation process, if you may?
Much too long, because what happened in the middle of that is we got a lot of customers, but we found ourselves at really an awkward price point. We found ourselves at like anywhere from 10 to maybe like $50,000 to $60,000 price point a year. And the packaging and structure of us building the business was fundamentally incorrect. So what we did is we had this open source framework. And one of the things you could do with the open source framework was you could create your report as a standalone HTML file. So I could create a standalone HTML file that was fully interactive. I could email it to someone, post it on Slack, post it on S3, whatever it was. Then we had our enterprise products and our mid-market products, which was hosting of reports and automation of reports. And people would be using the open source side and say, hey, you want to host these? You want to share them with marketing? You can use DataPane Cloud. What we did realize from that is like, okay, great. If you're a small startup, maybe it's easier to use DataPane Cloud to build and host these reports. You want some self-service portal basically for discovering data science in the organization. If you're an enterprise, our open source version was a better enterprise product than our enterprise product. So we ended up in all these discussions with companies like Ubisoft was like a super heavy user of DataPane. They went to meetups and talked about like how they're using DataPane to do things. And they just used our open source version. They were technical enough to basically have pipelines where we were inside of their Spark cluster creating reports and then they host them on S3. That was a better product. They had their IAM roles on top of that. They were able to control it. It was all on their own infrastructure. The same with Amazon, the same with NVIDIA. We got some logs just from people using our reports. We saw the IP ranges and we were like, how come we're doing like 4 million report generations a day inside of NVIDIA IP ranges? Then you realize they basically packaged us up as a core part of their reporting infrastructure as well at the time. So it was this kind of interesting thing where our open source version was a better product than our paid version.
That's such a classical challenge being in the open source space. Like, how do you gatekeep the features for the paid version? And if your free version is too good, then nobody pay for it. But it sounded like at least at that stage, your assumption or your approach is to sort of differentiate the free versus paid by providing managed hosting. And any additional features you add on top of a managed hosting?
Yeah, so it was hosting and then it was automation. So it was like, okay, we launched something called Data Pane Apps where you could programmatically generate reports. So instead of them being generated, on your own notebook or whatever, cron job somewhere, you could have interactive forms and wizards where your end users could enter some parameters, upload a file, and generate a report. But again, like for the people who were very heavy users for us, that was not necessarily, they could build that. It wasn't like rocket science for them to create. And they wanted to. I think actually Twitter, I was remember talking to someone at Twitter at some point. Twitter were using DataPane. They were like, yeah, like we kind of just like built this into our infrastructure.
I won't be surprised if someone on my team used your product before. I've definitely heard of the product. I have not personally used it, but yeah, that's the sort of pros and cons of being open source. You automatically have brand recognition. You automatically have people use it in all kinds of companies, and you're spot on with your own experience on the other side. It's very difficult for you to sort of jump from open source being used by all the engineers to find out like who has the budget to be wanting this so much that they're willing to pay for it, knowing that there is a free version out there, and that probably does face a challenge. I'm curious, now that we recognize this is a challenge, anything you've tried, things that work well, work not so well, in terms of like specifically targeting what I call the people who have money kind of marketing. So are you like trying to get the enterprises, the Nvidias, the Twitters, the Amazons of the world to actually pay for it, or are you trying to more like use it as the brand recognition, the establishment of your legitimacy of an ecosystem player to try to convince like other folks to pay for it? Or have there ever been a thought around like maybe some hobbies are willing to pay like $10 a month subscription? I'm just curious the thinking process of migrating from free open source tool to the monetization aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I answer that, I caveat my answer by saying there's nothing more dangerous than something that's sort of working. And because DataPane was sort of working, it meant that we were scared to move really, really quickly and go all in on something. When it's day zero, you go all in. You say, we're just building for this niche and we're going to try it for 10 days and like, let's see how far we can get. Because we had built this like reporting infrastructure, which a lot of people, hundreds of thousands or millions of people relied on, it was very, very difficult for us to move really, really quickly and be really aggressive on that. And I think that was to our fault because we had a very heterogeneous top of funnel. So we had a top of funnel which consisted of everything from, I remember at one point, there was like this kindergarten in Germany using it for doing lesson plans.
Wow.
The Mexican military was using it for tracking narco terrorists. And then it was used by like most banks as well. And so what we didn't do is say, okay, we're just going to build something for finance. Like we have this great use case around helping quants share reports with portfolio managers. One of our customers was GIC, the Singaporean Sovereign Wealth Fund. They were using it to do it. It's a great use case for finance.
Yeah.
We probably should have just doubled down on one thing. I mean, like we're just for financial reporting, and we could have built like pretty profitable business around that. But because we had this like open source top of funnel, it blinded us a bit from that focus.
I want to switch gear a little bit because it sounds like you have this amazing and really good user growth. And then you identified a lot of these leads are not qualified leads. To June's point, the people with budget, we call them decision makers. The decision makers didn't enter the funnel. It's the users enter the funnel. So I'm curious, like, have you ever tried to run some advertising or do like some marketing to get into the decision makers' eyes?
Yeah, we didn't do this well. Like, I think we had very, very good technical execution. I think we ran decent sales processes. That holistic marketing piece, we did not do well at the time. And we could have done a bunch of stuff because we had like a lot of retargeting, obviously, that we could have done because we had the embed. There was a lot of like things we could have done on that, like non-development marketing. But I think the problem was focus. We were just like not focused on one thing. We were like firefighting hundreds of different use cases, hundreds of different users. And yeah, I think that we didn't do enough in terms of marketing it towards the non-technical buyer. One other thing I'd say, when you end up in this process where a data scientist brings you in and then you are they don't have budget, so you're selling to their boss, or not actually their boss, to the head of marketing where budget comes from. You end up in this situation where you're basically selling the output of the data science team back into the business. You're basically saying, you need to solve this problem with data science. I'm going to help you solve it better. So pay us money to help your data science team do it. So you have to do a ton of discovery through that. And through that, you discover a bunch of really interesting problems you could help them solve, but it's really complex. You're like helping an internal team sell their output to another team inside the company, which requires like a very high price point if you're going to do that.
Thanks. And just to double down on Frost's question, is it then fair to say you sort of blur the line between your organic user growth and success from the open source to the decision makers marketing, and then you're relying on the organic user growth to sort of or almost like replacing your decision maker marketing with the open source? That's why your sales process is more cumbersome than you would have expected?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we also didn't, at least if you're spending ad dollars, like people say, okay, here's my cost per click or whatever, right? Here's my CAC. With open source, people don't really do that. You just think, oh, it's free. But it's not really free because it takes up your time. So I think like what we didn't do is like, I say, okay, here's like our funnel. It's like for each dollar we get in revenue, this is how we can attribute that revenue to, which we probably could have done, to attribute that revenue to our top of funnel and demand generation activities. Instead, it was just like, hey, we got loads of users. Let's try and find some deals in these users.
This is probably another sort of challenge of open source, especially like technical, like this is more like infrastructure kind of a tool, right? It's not directly generating any direct result. It's an intermediary. You have to convince the data science team to sell to the marketing team because it's a data science tool ultimately. And what I've heard or found in other similar stories is that the open source solutions are very likely get picked up by people who are technical. And then you have, again, like the NVIDIAs, the Amazons of the world who is using it. But those are almost the exact opposite of your ideal customer profile because they have enough engineers who can sort of tinker with this to eventually make anything work. And they don't have a lot of incentive to pay versus, as you were alluding to, maybe the sweet spot is the financial institutions who don't have as many engineers or as many specialized engineers who can sort of work on this visualization for their project and are more willing to buy some off-the-shelf product and then just get it over with. I'm curious, in that frame, if you were to try it again, would you do anything different?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the beauty of also verticalizing or focusing, I wouldn't actually even say it's just verticalizing. I think it's just focusing on a specific job to be done because that's what I think we would do differently if we were going to do data planning again is, the job to be done for, you think, okay, it's just people, a data scientist in a Jupyter notebook needs to share or whatever it is, or create a report. But the jobs to be done for why they're doing that are very, very different. And so if you take someone who's like a quant and then they build these very, very sophisticated reports, and if they don't get them as quickly as possible to the portfolio manager, like the fund could lose a lot of money, or if the portfolio manager doesn't understand them, they could lose a lot of money. The actual job to be done there in the use case is very different to someone who's doing an exploratory analysis or a quarterly business review for something internally, right? Or we had a lot of people using us for model monitoring in production. That was actually the Ubisoft and NVIDIA use case, which was, okay, I've got these models running and I want to introspect them and create reports so people can look at it. Very different job to be done. The job to be done there is like, we spend 100K a day on Spark, on Amazon, and we want to understand what's happening, right? So I think what we should have done is just picked one. And like maybe it was finance, maybe it wasn't, but we could have tested that. And I think that I've become a very big fan of specialization, which is like, the header on your website is like, we are the way financial institutions allow quants to collaborate with portfolio managers or something like that. And then that is the use case that you double down on. You build other features to support that use case as well.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, I want to always like bring it back to the marketing framework. So when you're getting all these leads, you basically have a framework to almost, because your sales cycle is long, but you can still assign a potential value of each lead, right? So if someone is a data analyst, there's a value. If someone is a data science manager, if someone is a marketing analytics manager, you have different value in your lead generation or a potential revenue gain. And then I would assume if you categorize it based on industry use cases or even user frequency, then you can find the specific vertical you want to triple down. Is that what you try to say, Leo? I just try to like bring it back to.
Yeah, completely. I think it's doing that kind of segmentation, picking one segment that you can go deep on, because I think as an early stage startup, you just cannot do more than one thing at a time. I think it's like you just have energy to do one thing, do it really well. I think there's also this separate problem, obviously, in open source, which is like you don't have a lot of data. So like we had this open source library used by a bunch of people, and then people would just show up. Like, especially when we switched it off, when we shut down the company, all these people people from like, Amazon or whoever would show up and be like, hey, what's going on? It's like, we never knew you existed. And on our cloud version, even people would always sign up with their personal Gmail. And so it was actually very difficult to find out who our users were as well. So yeah, I think like segmentation, specialization, and then just running quite ruthless experiments on what's working and what isn't, and then tailoring the product towards those use cases.
I think you're absolutely right, but that's sort of still tied to some of the nature of open source itself, because that your user, like your organic, like free marketing does not automatically come with the decision maker. So some dedicated marketing effort is probably still required for you to find the decision maker who don't even know what Python is, but you need the separate marketing or engagement to actually help them. And your developer who is using your open source version can be the advocate when it comes to their time to help.
Totally, yeah. I think the flip side to that is to run a process where you do that, I think that you should probably be charging north of 100K a year ACV.
Yes.
Because it's complex. That's not a fast sales process.
Yeah.
And we found ourselves stuck in this kind of like middle of like 10 to 30K. And it's a very difficult place to operate, running a like multi-stage sales process at that price point.
You sort of talked about it as like a lot of lesson learned, but I also want to at least give the audience of our show some context. This is still a fairly successful venture-backed startup. How much money have you raised? How long did it take? Like, what's the organization like? And also, we didn't say in the beginning, you were also running this between US and UK. How was that experience?
Yeah, so DataPane was actually, we sunset DataPane last year. So the company's no longer active. The open source library is still there, and I think someone's forked it actually and created like a community-led fork, which is great. So people are still using it. We're very happy about. But yeah, I mean, the backstory, as you mentioned, is we were a venture-backed startup as well. So this wasn't just a community project. This was something where we were on our timeline and we needed to have something that was like very obviously working. And as I pointed to before, the risk is something that's sort of working. If something's like just not working at all, then it's fine. Just try something new, right? You keep trying new things, keep rolling the dice. But with DataPane, we found there was something that was like sort of working, which is why we decided to sunset this project.
Can you comment a little bit more on the geographic challenges, benefits? Why did you do it that way?
Yeah, so we were based in the UK primarily. We were remote. I'd lived in the Bay Area for 8 years at some points in my life. I'd been back and forth a lot, San Francisco, but we were in the UK at the time. And I think like on the micro, like day-to-day level, that doesn't feel like a problem at the time because you can hire fantastic engineers. The cost of running a startup's a lot lower. You know, you're in a good time zone, all these other things. But I actually think that to build a company like that, where you're like, we're going for the stars, we're going to build like the most popular open source library, San Francisco, you are at a disadvantage if you're not in San Francisco. And I think it doesn't come on like your day-to-day. You can write code anywhere, but it comes to just like the opportune meetings that you end up having by being in San Francisco, and that's where the early adopters are, right? So it might be that you go to a, I don't know, meetup, present what you're working on, someone goes, oh, that's great. I work at Uber. I'd love to have you come in and speak to everyone. And then on their website, you've got a quote from someone from Uber and you've got a great proof of concept to get started. So I think for building a business, San Francisco is a fantastic place. The UK is very different in terms of the sales process and sales cycles. People are a lot more conservative. And then I also just think like collaborating with other people in the industry. So your complex It's a lot easier if you're in the Bay Area. I mean, I'll give you like a very quick example of this, which is like Frost and I just like met for coffee in San Francisco this week. And now we're doing a podcast, right? That was somebody who obviously I only met previously when I was in San Francisco, and London is a very different ecosystem.
Okay, welcome back to the San Francisco Bay Area. And also thank you for sharing. I'm sorry that the company did not work out as the original vision has hoped to be, but thank you for sharing the whole journey and the story, the thinking process, and the challenges and the successes you've had. Frost, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to conclude. It was DataPane still a very successful product. When after I talked to Leo, I searched on it, and like Popular and all these companies still mention you everywhere in the tutorials. And I think that's one thing we'll talk in our next episode again with Leo again. Like there's one thing called user growth. There's another thing called revenue growth. And you kind of have to decide when you want to go into the revenue mode. We were just making a joke when I was working at Twitter. We were only in user growth mode back in 2011, 2012. When June joined, it's all about revenue growth. And he built that amazing engine. And I think that's kind of the sort of nature for everything. But thank you so much for sharing, Leo, especially the amazing, all the trade-offs that were happening in your mind when I cannot imagine when you wake up and you see your calendar were booked for 3 weeks by the biggest construction companies and all these biggest financial institute around the world.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, and I think that's true. And just to your point, Ross, on like revenue growth versus user growth, I guess I'd leave it with there's that Mark Andreessen quote that like the only thing that matters is product market fit. And like the market really matters of that equation, right? And I'm
Yeah.
not sure that it was a great market to build a company in. I think we managed to build a really great product, which is awesome. But I'm not sure that it was a great market.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Well, thank you so much, Leo, again, to come to our show. And we'll see him very soon again for his next amazing product of PumpUp.com.
Thank you, Leo. We'll talk again very soon.
Great to be here. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.